The cold, sterile air of the lawyer's office felt like a tomb. It was the place where a 20-year marriage had come to die. Donald Lewis, a man whose face was plastered on the cover of business magazines, slid a piece of paper across the vast mahogany table. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a settlement offer. It was a flimsy lottery ticket. His voice, usually so commanding in boardrooms, was now dripping with scorn. "Here," he sneered, his eyes cold and empty. "A little something to remember me by. Don't go spending all your future earnings in one place." His wife, Clara, just stared at it, her world crumbling around her. He had just stripped her of everything, leaving her with pennies after she had helped him build an empire worth billions. And now, this final insult. This cheap piece of paper was a symbol of her foolish hopes, a dream he had long since crushed. She could feel the tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him. Donald laughed, a short, ugly sound that echoed in the silent room. He thought it was a brilliant joke, the perfect, cruel ending to their story. But what he didn't know was that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a story so unbelievable, so packed with fate, that it would shake his entire world to its very core. Before we see how this one piece of paper changes everything, I want to ask you for something small. This is a story about hope when all hope seems lost. It's for anyone who has ever felt invisible or pushed aside. If that feeling is familiar to you, I'm personally asking you to join our story-loving family by subscribing to this channel. It lets us know we're not alone. And please, in the comments below, tell us what city or country you are watching from. Seeing how far our stories travel connects us all in a special way. We believe that sharing your place in this world invites a wave of goodness and unexpected blessings into your home, for both you and your family. Their story hadn't started in a cold lawyer's office. It began in a tiny, one-bedroom apartment where the rain would sometimes leak through the ceiling. Donald Lewis was just a man with a wild dream then, sketching ideas on coffee-stained napkins. He had nothing to his name but a brilliant mind and a heart full of promises. Clara worked 2 jobs, her hands tired and sore, just to keep food on their table. She would listen to his plans for hours, her eyes shining with belief. She wasn't just his wife, she was his first investor, paying with her faith, her time, and every bit of her energy. The first big success came 5 years later. It was a software deal that put $1 million into their bank account overnight. Donald was ecstatic, and for a while they were happy. They bought a nice house, but not too big. He was still the man she loved. But that first million was like a taste of a powerful drug. He wanted more. The late nights at the office became all-nighters. The sweet phone calls he used to make during the day stopped. He started talking about profit margins and stock options, words that felt foreign and cold in their warm little home. The man she loved was slowly being replaced by a stranger. Clara remembered their 10th anniversary vividly. She had spent all day cooking his favorite meal, filling their home with the smells he used to love. She waited and waited. The food grew cold on the table. He finally came home long after midnight, not with flowers or an apology, but with a wild look in his eyes. He hadn't forgotten their anniversary, it just hadn't been important enough. He had closed a deal that day, a deal that made them hundreds of millions of dollars. As he talked excitedly about the numbers, Clara looked at the lonely, uneaten dinner and felt a crack form in her heart. In the years that followed, the crack grew into a canyon. Donald became a titan of industry, a billionaire who could buy anything he wanted. He bought mansions they never lived in, cars they never drove, and showered her with jewels that felt like cold stones against her skin. He saw her as a beautiful object to have on his arm at fancy parties, a part of his successful image. He forgot she had a voice, dreams of her own, and a heart that was slowly starving for the simple love they once shared. The warmth of their tiny apartment was a distant, faded memory in the cold emptiness of their palace. The final argument wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, which made it so much more painful. He told her she no longer fit into his world. He said she was too simple, too plain, too attached to the small life they had left behind. "I am building a legacy, Clara," he had said, his voice void of all emotion. "And you are just sentimental." Each word was a carefully aimed blow. He wasn't just ending their marriage, he was erasing her entire contribution to his life, dismissing the woman who stood by him when he had absolutely nothing. That conversation led them here, to this moment in the lawyer's office. Clara's hand trembled as she picked up the lottery ticket. The paper felt thin and worthless, just like she did. She watched Donald sign the final divorce papers with a bold, arrogant stroke of his pen. He stood up, adjusted his $1,000 suit, and walked toward the door, a king leaving his conquered castle. He didn't look back. Clara was now officially alone, with nothing but a few $1,000s and a mocking gift from the man she had given her life to. She felt a single tear finally escape and trace a cold path down her cheek. Just before he walked out, Donald paused at the doorway, his hand on the golden handle. He turned his head slightly, not enough to face her, but just enough so she could hear his final, cutting words. "Good luck with your future, Clara," he said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I truly hope you win." And then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. Clara sat there, surrounded by a crushing silence, clutching the lottery ticket in her fist. He thought he had left her with a joke. He believed he had taken everything. But he had no idea that in his final act of mockery, he had just handed her $1 billion secret. 20 years ago, their world wasn't made of cold marble and silent, empty rooms. It was a tiny apartment on the 5th floor of a building with a broken elevator. The smell of rain-soaked concrete and their neighbors cooking always filled the air. This was their kingdom. Donald and Clara would share a single plate of pasta, their knees touching under a wobbly kitchen table, and they would talk for hours about the future. They had no money, but they were rich in a way Donald had long since forgotten. They had dreams, and more importantly, they had each other. But a question lingered even then. Can a dream for two people truly survive when only one of them gets to the top? Back then, Donald's eyes weren't cold and calculating. They were filled with fire. He would pace their small living room, his hands moving excitedly as he described the company he would one day build. He wasn't talking about billions then. He was talking about changing the world, about creating something that would last. He once took Clara's hands in his gaze so intense it felt like he was looking into her soul. "I promise you, Clara," he had said, his voice thick with emotion, "when we make it, we won't just be rich. We will be happy. I will never let the money change us." It was a promise she held onto like a precious jewel for years. Clara believed him with every fiber of her being. She worked tirelessly to protect his dream. Her days were a blur of waiting tables at a small diner, where the smell of coffee and burnt toast clung to her clothes. Her nights were spent quietly cleaning empty office buildings, her mop swishing across silent floors. She would come home exhausted, her feet aching, but she never complained. Every dollar she earned went into their shared pot, paying for rent, for groceries, and for the parts Donald needed for his early computer prototypes. She was the unseen wind beneath his wings, pushing him higher, never asking for anything in return. There was a night when it almost all fell apart. An eviction notice was taped to their door, its red letters screaming at them. The landlord wanted 3 months of back rent, money they simply did not have. Donald slumped onto their worn-out sofa, his head in his hands. "It's over," he whispered, his voice broken. "I'm a failure, Clara. I've failed you." All the fire seemed to have vanished from his eyes, replaced by pure defeat. Clara looked at the man she loved, at the notice on the door, and at the impossible mountain in front of them. The dream was dying right before her eyes. But Clara wouldn't let it die. She knelt in front of him and gently lifted his chin. "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We are not failures." That night, she took a small, wooden box from under their bed. Inside was the money she had been saving for years, money to one day visit her aging parents in her home country. It wasn't much, but it was everything she had. Without a second thought, she gave it all to him. "This is for us," she told him, her belief unwavering. "You're going to make it. I know you are." He took the money, his dream reignited by her sacrifice. A week later, fueled by Clara's faith, the breakthrough came. In the middle of the night, an idea struck Donald like lightning. He jumped out of bed and started scribbling furiously on a cheap paper napkin, the only thing he could find. It was a mess of diagrams and notes, But in that mess was the core of a billion-dollar idea. He held it up for Clara to see, his face glowing with excitement. "This is it," he shouted. "This is the one." They celebrated with cheap wine, feeling like they were on top of the world. But there was something in his eyes that night, a new kind of hunger she hadn't seen before. Of course, an idea on a napkin wasn't enough. They needed real money to build a working model, and every bank they went to laughed them out of the building. They were too young, they had no history, no collateral. The doors slammed shut, one after another. The little money Clara had given him was gone, spent on parts for a machine that sat lifeless on their kitchen table. The hope that had burned so brightly just a few days before began to flicker and fade once again. They had the winning idea, but it felt like the world was determined to keep them from ever reaching the finish line. That was when Clara made her final, biggest sacrifice. She took off the simple gold necklace she always wore. It wasn't fancy, but it was the last thing her grandmother had given her before she passed away. It was her most treasured possession, her connection to her family and her past. With tears in her eyes, she walked into a pawn shop and came out with a few $100s. She never told Donald where the money came from. She just told him it was a lucky break. She knew the truth would have hurt his pride, and right then, his pride was all he had left. The money from the necklace was just enough. Donald finished the prototype. And this time, when he showed it to a small, private investor, the man didn't laugh. He saw the genius in it. He agreed to give them a small amount of seed money, enough to start a real company. It was the moment their lives changed forever. As they were leaving the meeting, the investor pulled Donald aside. Clara was a few feet away, but she overheard the man's words. "Remember, kid," the investor said with a grin. "In this business, you eat or you get eaten. Don't let anyone, not even family, hold you back." Now, sitting in the deafening silence of her new, empty life, Clara looked at the worthless lottery ticket in her hand. The investor's words from all those years ago echoed in her mind. Donald had learned that lesson all too well. He had eaten, and he had left her with nothing but crumbs. She thought back to that night in their tiny apartment, to the promise he had made her. It wasn't just about the money. It was about them, together, forever. He had promised that nothing would ever tear them apart. And as she stared at the cruel joke he had left her with, a new, cold fire started to burn within her. A fire he had never seen before. The first $1 million felt like a fantasy. Suddenly, the leaky roof and broken elevator were gone, replaced by a beautiful house with a small garden. For a few perfect months, it felt like they had made it. They would sit in their new backyard, holding hands, and it was almost like the old days. But then Donald bought a watch. It was a thick, gold thing that cost more than their first car. When he wore it, he seemed to stand a little taller, speak a little louder. Clara felt a tiny shiver of unease. Was this shiny piece of metal the first sign that he was leaving their shared world behind for one of his own? Their company, Apex Innovations, grew like a wildfire. Donald was no longer just the dreamer in their apartment. He was a CEO, a name people whispered with respect. He started spending his evenings with new friends, men who wore suits just as expensive as his. Clara tried to fit in. She would go to their fancy dinners, but she felt like a child wearing her mother's shoes. The talk was always about stocks, mergers, and things she didn't understand. One night, hiding in a quiet corner, she heard one of Donald's new partners laugh and say, "Don is a genius, but you can tell his wife is from simpler stock." The words stung more than she could ever admit. The man she loved was changing right before her eyes. The fire in his eyes was still there, but it wasn't for their shared dream anymore. It was for the next deal, the next million. When she would try to talk about her day at the diner, a job she kept for a while to feel normal, he would look bored. "Clara, we're past that now," he'd say, not unkindly, but with a distance that hurt more than anger. He was building a skyscraper, and she felt like she was being left on the ground floor, watching him get smaller and smaller as he rose higher and higher. Soon, the nice house with the garden was replaced by a mansion that felt more like a museum. It had 30 rooms, most of which they never entered. Strangers cooked their food and cleaned their clothes. Clara felt like a ghost haunting someone else's perfect life. She tried to make it feel like home, placing their old, worn-out photo album on a marble table. The next day, it was gone, replaced by a heavy art book. When she asked Donald, he barely looked up from his work. The designer said it didn't match the room's aesthetic, he explained. The message was clear: her memories, her past, did not belong here. The money, which was supposed to solve all their problems, became a giant, invisible wall between them. Donald would buy things: a private jet, a vacation home in a country she'd never heard of, and she would find out by reading about it in a magazine. She was his wife, but she felt like an employee who wasn't important enough to be told about company plans. One day, she broke down, telling him she felt lost and alone. He didn't hug her. He didn't comfort her. He simply opened his wallet and gave her a black credit card. "Buy whatever you want," he said. "Be happy." He truly believed that was the answer. She missed the man who loved picnics in the park. One sunny afternoon, she decided to bring that man back. She spent the morning making his favorite sandwiches and packed them in a simple basket. She drove for an hour to his new, towering glass office building, hoping to surprise him for lunch. But she couldn't even get past the front desk. "Mr. Lewis has a back-to-back schedule," his assistant said through a speaker, her voice cold and bored. "He cannot be disturbed." As Clara stood there, holding the basket, she looked up and saw him through the glass wall of a conference room on the 10th floor. He was laughing, surrounded by strangers, looking completely carefree. To escape the crushing loneliness of the mansion, Clara started volunteering at a women's shelter in the city. Here, surrounded by people who had nothing, she felt more at home than she ever did in her palace. She would serve food, listen to their stories, and offer a comforting hand. It was a secret world where she wasn't Mrs. Donald Lewis, the billionaire's wife. She was just Clara, a woman with a kind heart. This small act of service was the only thing that made her feel real anymore. But secrets in a life as public as theirs were impossible to keep. A photograph changed everything. A local newspaper did a story on the shelter, and in the background of one picture, there she was, handing a blanket to a child. Donald's business rival saw it and sent it to him with a note: "Guess your wife prefers the company of the poor." Donald wasn't angry, he was horrified. That night, his voice was dangerously quiet. "This is an embarrassment, Clara. My wife in a place like that. What will people think?" He didn't ask why she was there. He didn't care. He only cared about the image. He forbade her from ever going back. Her new job, he decided, was to be the perfect hostess. She had to plan and attend lavish parties filled with people whose names she couldn't remember. She would stand by his side for hours, a painted smile on her face, feeling like a beautiful, empty decoration. She watched the way other women, draped in diamonds and silk, looked at her husband. They looked at him like he was a prize to be won. And sometimes she saw the way he smiled back at them. A cold, terrifying fear began to grow in her heart. Was he just distant, or was he actively looking for someone new to stand beside him at the top? The fear became a certainty one Tuesday night. He came home late from a supposed business trip. As he took off his jacket, a scent hit her. It was a sweet, flowery perfume, one she had never smelled before. It wasn't hers. When she quietly asked him what the new smell was, his face turned to stone. He didn't explain. He attacked. "Must you always be so needy? So suspicious," he snapped. "I give you a life anyone would kill for, and all you do is question me." The man who had promised to never change was gone. And in his place was a cold, cruel stranger who was hiding a terrible secret. The perfume was a ghost that haunted the mansion. For days, Clara could smell it in her mind, a sweet, sickening scent of betrayal. Donald acted as if that night had never happened. He moved through their life with a cold, polished politeness, like a stranger they had invited to stay. There were no apologies, no explanations. The silence he created was louder than any argument. He was building a wall of indifference brick by brick, and she was trapped on the other side, left to wonder who the woman was that lived in the secret spaces of her husband's life. A week later, a small, velvet box appeared on her pillow. Inside was a diamond necklace, each stone a perfect, glittering tear. In their early days, a gift like this would have been a dream come true. Now it felt like an insult. It wasn't a gift of love, it was a payment. It was a beautiful, expensive way of saying, "Here, take this shiny thing and be quiet. Don't ask questions. Don't look too closely at my life." She put the necklace on, and it felt as cold against her skin as his heart had become. The diamonds felt heavy, like a chain. Clara started to see things she had been blind to before. It was like her eyes were suddenly opened. She noticed how he would quickly end a phone call if she walked into the room. She saw how he bought a new, smaller laptop that he kept locked in a briefcase he took everywhere, even inside their own home. He started talking about business trips to cities he had never mentioned before. Each little detail was a piece of a puzzle she didn't want to solve, because she knew the final picture would shatter her world completely. She felt a deep, aching loneliness that the giant, empty rooms of the mansion only made worse. To fight it, she would walk through the halls, touching the cold walls, and remember their tiny apartment. She remembered how they used to share a single armchair, laughing as they tried to both fit. They had nothing then, but they had a connection so strong she thought it was unbreakable. How could something so real just vanish? How could a man who once shared his deepest fears with her now be a complete and total stranger? The truth arrived on a quiet Wednesday morning. Donald was taking a long shower, the sound of the water a distant hiss. His phone, which he guarded like a dragon guards its treasure, was sitting on the bedside table. It buzzed once. Then again. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She told herself not to look, to walk away. But she couldn't. Her hand trembled as she moved closer. On the glowing screen was a message from a woman named Sophia. The words were simple, and they burned themselves into her mind. "I'm still thinking about last night. You are incredible. Miss you already." In that single moment, the world fell away. The sound of the shower, the ticking of the clock, the very air in her lungs, it all disappeared. It was one thing to suspect, to live with the ghosts of perfume and lies. It was another thing to see the proof, written in plain, cruel words. The crack in her heart didn't just widen, it broke open completely. She stood there, frozen, staring at the phone. This wasn't just a mistake or a single night. This was a relationship. Donald was living another life, a secret life where she had no part. What could she do? She imagined screaming at him, showing him the phone. But she could already picture his reaction. He would twist it, turn it back on her. He would call her crazy, jealous, insecure. He would use his powerful voice and clever words to make her feel like she was the one in the wrong. He had done it before in smaller ways. This time, he would do it to protect his new life. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that no one would believe her over the great Donald Lewis. She was just the simple, quiet wife. So, she said nothing. But a change happened inside her. The hurt and the sadness began to mix with something new, a cold, quiet anger. She started watching him, not as a wife, but as an outsider. She saw the way he smiled at his phone when he thought she wasn't looking. She noticed the new clothes he was buying, more stylish and youthful than he used to wear. He was a man in love, but he wasn't in love with her. He was performing a part for his real audience of one, and Clara was just a forgotten character in the background of his stage. She made one last, desperate attempt to find the man she married. She found the old, coffee-stained napkin on which he had first drawn his billion-dollar idea. She had saved it all these years. That evening, she placed it by his dinner plate. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought you might want to see it, to remember where it all started." She hoped it would spark something in him, a memory of the hopeful, loving man he used to be. She was searching for a sign that he was still in there somewhere. Donald picked up the napkin, glanced at it, and a small, dismissive smile crossed his face. He crumpled it in his hand. "Clara, this is junk from the past," he said, tossing the little ball of paper into the trash can. "We're billionaires now. We don't need to remember being poor and desperate." He didn't see the idea, the dream, or her belief. He just saw a reminder of a life he was ashamed of. In that moment, she knew. The man she had loved, the man she had sacrificed everything for, was well and truly gone. He hadn't just left her, he had erased her. The crumpled napkin in the trash can was a tombstone. It marked the death of their shared past, of the man he once was. Clara didn't cry. The tears had frozen somewhere deep inside her, turning into a cold, hard stone of clarity. For years, she had been trying to fix the cracks in their marriage, believing that if she just tried hard enough, she could find the old Donald again. But now she saw the truth. You cannot fix something that the other person has already thrown away. And she was left with a terrifying question. What do you do when you realize the last 20 years of your life were built on a promise that had expired? That night, she found him in his grand study, a room filled with leather-bound books he had never read. He was staring at his new, secret laptop, a small smile on his face. She knew who he was smiling at. The silence between them had become a roaring monster, and she decided it was time to face it. With a steadiness that surprised even herself, she asked the question that had been haunting her for months. "Donald," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "are you happy?" He looked up, startled, his smile vanishing. It was a simple question, but they both knew what she was really asking. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he attacked. "What kind of question is that?" he snapped, closing the laptop with a loud click. "I gave you a palace to live in, diamonds to wear, a life of complete ease. And you ask me if I'm happy? You should be asking yourself why you can't just be grateful for everything I've given you." His voice was laced with poison. He was trying to make her feel small and greedy, to turn his betrayal into her failure to be content. But Clara had lived with her own feelings of failure for years. She was no longer afraid of them. For the very first time, she didn't shrink away from his anger. The woman who used to cry and apologize now stood tall. "I am not talking about the house or the diamonds, Donald," she said, her voice shaking just a little. "I'm talking about us. About your promise." The cold, hard stone of clarity inside her was giving her a strength she never knew she possessed. She looked him directly in the eye, and the look on her face told him that the simple, quiet wife he thought he knew was gone. She was no longer willing to live inside his carefully constructed lies. Her strength seemed to infuriate him. It was a challenge to his power, and he couldn't stand it. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. "Promise?" he spat, his face twisted in a sneer. "We were kids playing in a sandbox, Clara. The world is different now. I am different. You want to know if I'm happy? No, I'm not happy. Not with this. Not with you." The words were designed to hurt, to crush the last bit of hope she might have been holding on to. But he wasn't finished yet. "I want a divorce," he said. The 4 words hung in the air, cold and final. "I have met someone. Someone who understands my world. Someone who isn't stuck in the past, clinging to old, sentimental junk." He was talking about the napkin. He was talking about their entire history together. He was dismissing every sacrifice she had ever made, every late night she had waited up for him, every bit of faith she had poured into his dream. He wasn't just ending their marriage, he was trying to erase it, to pretend it never mattered. Clara felt the floor disappear from under her feet. She had expected it, known it was coming, but hearing the words out loud still stole the breath from her lungs. This was it. The breaking point. The final, irreversible shattering of her life. She sank into a chair, not because she was weak, but because her body could no longer hold the weight of so much pain. She looked at this man, this powerful stranger in a $1,000 suit, and she could not find a single trace of the boy she fell in love with in a tiny 5th-floor apartment. Donald, seeing her silence as a victory, pressed his advantage. "My lawyers will be in touch," he said, his voice now calm and businesslike. "They will prepare an agreement. I will be fair, of course. I'll give you enough to live comfortably." His idea of fair was a slap in the face. He was offering her a tiny fraction of the empire she had helped him build, a small allowance to keep her quiet and out of his way. He was firing her from the job of being his wife, with a small severance package for her 20 years of service. He walked toward the door, then stopped, turning back to look at her one last time. There was no sadness in his eyes, no regret. There was only a cold pity. "You have to understand, Clara," he said, as if explaining a simple business deal. "You were the perfect wife for the man who was struggling. But I am not that man anymore. You simply don't fit the brand I'm building." He was talking about their life, their love, their marriage, as if it were a product to be marketed. Then he left. He closed the heavy wooden door behind him, and the click of the latch sounded like a prison cell locking. Clara was alone in the silent, suffocating room. He had taken her past and called it junk. He had taken her present and shattered it. And he had taken her future and told her she had no place in it. She was nothing to him now but a brand that no longer fit. She sat there for hours, surrounded by wealth, but feeling poorer than she had ever been in her life. How could she possibly survive this? The hours after he left were the loudest silence Clara had ever known. She remained in the study, a statue in a room that suddenly felt alien. Every object, the heavy desk, the leather chairs, the golden pens, seemed to mock her. They were all part of his brand, his new life. She was the only thing in the room that no longer belonged. A ghost of a memory he was eager to forget. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in colors she was too numb to see, a chilling thought took root in her mind. How do you start over when you can't even remember who you were before? The next few days were a gray, featureless fog. Clara drifted through the mansion like a shadow, the silence broken only by the distant, respectful whispers of the staff. They moved around her carefully, their eyes full of a pity she couldn't bear to see. Each meal was served on perfect china at a dining table that could seat 30, but she was always alone. The food had no taste. The beautiful, manicured gardens outside the windows felt like a cage. This wasn't a home. It was the magnificent, empty tomb of her marriage, and she was the only one left to haunt it. One afternoon, seeking refuge, she went into her walk-in closet. It was a room bigger than her entire first apartment, filled with rows of expensive dresses she rarely wore. Tucked away in the very back, behind gowns of silk and satin, was a simple cotton sundress. It was old and faded, the dress she wore on her first date with Donald. As her fingers brushed against the worn fabric, another memory surfaced. It was from a few weeks ago, just before the final break. A memory of a small, secret act of rebellion that she had almost completely forgotten. She had been at a small grocery store miles from their wealthy neighborhood, a place where no one knew her name. It was the only place she felt like herself. As she paid for her milk and bread, she saw a sign for the lottery. The jackpot was $1 billion, a number so large it was meaningless. Donald always scoffed at the lottery, calling it a stupid tax on desperate people. And in that moment, feeling so incredibly desperate herself, she did something he would have hated. She bought a ticket. It was a secret wish, a tiny what if, in a life that had no room for her own dreams. Back in the cold present, a jolt of energy shot through her. The ticket. That small piece of paper. Where was it? It was a foolish, meaningless thing, but suddenly, it was the only thing in the entire mansion that was truly hers. She scrambled to the purse she had used that day, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the clasp. She emptied its contents onto the bed. A wallet, keys, lipstick, tissues, but no ticket. A knot of panic tightened in her stomach. Had she lost it? Had she thrown it away, dismissing it as quickly as Donald had dismissed her? She moved through the room like a storm, her usual quiet grace gone. She checked the pockets of every coat, her fingers digging into the silk linings. She pulled open drawers, her carefully organized scarves and gloves now in a messy pile on the floor. Nothing. The hope, as tiny and absurd as it was, began to vanish, replaced by a familiar wave of despair. Of course it was gone. It was just another failed dream, another little thing she couldn't even manage to hold on to. It was proof that she truly had nothing left. Defeated, she sank to the carpet. Her frantic search had knocked over a small, wooden box from her nightstand. It slid across the floor and stopped at her feet. It was the box that once held her grandmother's necklace, the one she sold to fund Donald's first prototype. She hadn't opened it in almost 20 years. It was a container of painful memories, of a sacrifice that had led to this very moment. But something compelled her to reach for it. Her heart thumped a strange rhythm in her chest. Her fingers, still trembling, slowly lifted the lid. The velvet inside was old and faded. And resting right in the middle, where the necklace used to lie, was the lottery ticket. She remembered now. She had put it there that day, hiding her small, foolish wish in the one place that represented her greatest act of love and sacrifice. A place Donald would never, ever think to look. She gently lifted it out, the thin paper feeling strangely significant in her hand. It felt like she was holding the ghost of a possibility. She stared at the numbers. 12, 28, 34, 47, 51, and a power number of 22. They were just random digits, a meaningless code. For a moment, the reality of her situation came crashing back down. This was just a lottery ticket. It couldn't fix her life. It couldn't mend her broken heart or give her back the years she had lost. The brief flicker of hope felt childish and silly. What was she doing, putting her faith in a 1 in a billion chance? It was the kind of desperate hope Donald had always made fun of. With a deep, sighing breath that carried the weight of her entire life, she walked to the elegant silver wastebasket in the corner of the room. This was where dreams went to die. She held the ticket over the bin, her fingers ready to release it. It was time to let go of all the foolish hopes, all the what-ifs, and face the empty reality ahead. Her fingers loosened. The ticket began to slip. But at that exact second, a sound drifted up from the living room downstairs. A news reporter's voice on the television, clear and urgent. "Again, we have breaking news," the voice announced. "The record-breaking billion-dollar lottery ticket, sold right here in our city, is still unclaimed." The reporter's voice sliced through the silence, and Clara's hand froze in midair. The lottery ticket, a moment from becoming trash, suddenly felt heavy, like it held the weight of the entire world. Her heart, which had been beating with a slow, dull ache, began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. The words echoed in the vast room, "Sold right here in our city, still unclaimed." It was a crazy thought, a whisper of impossible hope in a mind filled with despair. Could it be? Or was this just the universe playing another one of its cruel jokes on her? She pulled her hand back from the wastebasket as if it had been burned. She looked down at the ticket, at the simple, printed numbers. Donald's mocking voice filled her head, laughing at her for being so foolish. A stupid tax on desperate people? And she was desperate. Maybe that's all this was, her broken mind clinging to a fantasy. The logical part of her brain screamed that the odds were impossible, that this was a path to even more disappointment. But another part of her, a part she thought was long dead, whispered a dangerous question. What if? She had to know. Not because she believed she had won, but because she needed to kill this last, tiny spark of hope. She needed to see the losing numbers with her own eyes so she could finally stop dreaming and face the cold, hard truth of her new life. It would be a final, painful confirmation that she was completely and utterly alone, with no magic ticket to save her. Clutching the thin piece of paper, she walked out of the bedroom, her footsteps echoing on the marble floors, each step taking her closer to a truth that would either set her free or break her completely. The living room was dark, the curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. The only light came from the giant television screen, where the news channel's bright, flashing graphics seemed loud and aggressive. The reporter, a woman with a serious face, was on screen, standing in front of a picture of a lottery ball machine. Clara's shadow stretched long and thin across the expensive rug as she approached. She felt small and insignificant in the face of the massive screen. She stopped a few feet away, her knuckles white as she squeezed the ticket in her fist. Her future was about to be decided by 6 little numbers. "Let's recap those winning numbers one more time for anyone just tuning in," the reporter said, her voice crisp and clear. Clara's eyes darted down to her ticket, then back up at the screen. "The first number is 12. A jolt went through Clara's body. The first number on her ticket was 12. Her breath caught in her throat. It was nothing. Just a coincidence. Millions of people probably had the number 12. She willed her heart to slow down, telling herself not to be a fool. But it was too late. The tiny, dangerous seed of hope had already begun to sprout. "The second number," the reporter continued, "is 28. Clara's eyes flew back to the ticket. 20. It was there. The seed of hope grew a little bigger. This was strange. This was an unbelievable coincidence. Her mind started to feel fuzzy, a strange buzzing sound filling her ears. Followed by 34. It was on her ticket. Her hand began to shake. 3 in a row. The room started to feel like it was tilting, the floor shifting beneath her feet. This couldn't be happening. She was dreaming. She had to be. This kind of thing didn't happen in real life, especially not to people like her. The fourth number is 47. The reporter's voice seemed to come from far away. Clara didn't need to look anymore. She had stared at the ticket so many times that the numbers were burned into her mind. 47. It was there. And the fifth is 51. 51. It was also there. The buzzing in her ears grew louder. The world outside the television screen and the piece of paper in her hand simply ceased to exist. 5 numbers. All 5 of them matched. All that was left was the final, single power number. The one that separated a small prize from a world-changing fortune. The reporter on the screen paused, a slight smile on her face. "And now for the one that makes all the difference," she said, drawing out the moment. "The final power number is..." Time seemed to stop. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. Clara held her breath, her entire life, her entire future, balanced on the edge of this single, final number. She glanced at her ticket one last time. The power number was 22. 22, the reporter announced, her voice booming in the silent room. Clara stood there, frozen. The ticket slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered silently to the plush carpet. It was a perfect match. Every single number. $1 billion. The number was so big it had no meaning. It was an idea, not a reality. Her mind couldn't grasp it. She stared at the screen, where a graphic flashed. $1 billion winner. Her brain tried to connect the words on the screen to the piece of paper on the floor, to herself, but it couldn't. This was impossible. This was a dream. This was a mistake. Slowly, like an old woman, she sank to her knees. The strength was gone from her legs, from her entire body. She looked at the ticket lying on the floor. It looked so small, so ordinary. How could this tiny thing hold the power to change everything? Then, a sound bubbled up from her chest. It was a strange, broken sound, half a laugh and half a sob. She wasn't just the woman Donald had thrown away. She wasn't the simple, quiet wife anymore. She was now one of the richest people on the entire planet. And her very first thought wasn't about the money. It was about the look on Donald's face when he found out. For a long time, Clara just knelt there on the floor. The world was a distant, muffled sound. Her mind was like a shaken snow globe, a blizzard of impossible thoughts. $1 billion. The words didn't make sense together. She kept replaying the reporter's voice in her head, then looking at the ticket, then back at the flashing screen. Was this a dream? Was she so broken by the divorce that her mind had created a beautiful, impossible fantasy to protect her? She gently pinched the skin on the back of her hand, half expecting to wake up in her cold, empty bed. The small sting of pain was her first confirmation. This was real. With hands that shook so much she could barely control them, she reached for her phone on a nearby table. She had to see it somewhere else. A news channel could make a mistake. A dream could feel real. But the official lottery website wouldn't lie. Her fingers felt clumsy as she typed the address. The page loaded slowly, each second stretching into an eternity. And then there they were. The winning numbers, displayed in bold, black digits against a white screen. 12, 28, 34, 47, 51, and the power number, 22. They stared back at her, cold, factual, and undeniable. The mansion, which had always felt so huge and intimidating, suddenly seemed to shrink. The towering ceilings, the expensive paintings, the priceless statues, they were just things. They were toys. The amount of money she now possessed was so vast, she could buy this entire house and the one next to it, and the entire street, and not even notice the money was gone. For the first time since she had stepped foot in this place, she didn't feel like a visitor or a prisoner. The power had shifted. The house didn't own her anymore. She could own it, or she could burn it to the ground. The ticket, that flimsy piece of paper on the floor, was now the most valuable object she had ever touched. It was a key to a new universe. A wild surge of fear, sharp and cold, shot through her. What if something happened to it? What if a maid found it and threw it away? What if a sudden gust of wind blew it into the fireplace? She scrambled on her hands and knees and snatched it up, holding it to her chest as if it were a fragile, newborn baby. She needed to hide it. She needed to put it somewhere safe, somewhere no one would ever look. Her eyes landed on the small, wooden box on the floor. The box that once held her grandmother's necklace. The box that represented her greatest sacrifice for Donald. A slow smile spread across her face. It was the perfect place. A place full of memories he had called junk. She walked over, her steps now steady and sure, and placed the ticket inside, right on the faded velvet where her past used to be. She closed the lid. It was no longer a box of painful memories. It was now a treasure chest, and its contents were the secret to her future. Just as she placed the box back on her nightstand, her phone began to ring, its sharp sound cutting through the quiet. She glanced at the screen. The name flashing was Arthur Vance, Donald's lead lawyer. Her stomach twisted into a familiar knot of fear, a reflex from years of feeling powerless. The monster was calling. He was probably calling to schedule the meeting where he would hand her a check for what Donald considered enough and send her away forever. But what did the monster do when he discovered you were no longer afraid of him? A strange calm washed over her. The fear was gone, replaced by a cool, clear confidence she had never felt before. She let the phone ring one more time, then answered, her voice even and smooth. "Hello, Arthur." The lawyer sounded surprised by her tone. He was used to her being timid and quiet. He began to talk about the divorce agreement, using big, important words designed to make her feel small. He spoke of Donald's extreme generosity and the need to finalize things quickly and quietly. Clara listened, a silent laugh building inside her. "Of course," she said when he finished, her voice so calm it was almost chilling. "A meeting sounds fine. Just have your office send me the details." She hung up before he could say another word. She could almost feel his confusion through the phone. The sheep was no longer acting like a sheep. She stood in the middle of her bedroom and looked at her reflection in a giant gold-framed mirror. The woman looking back at her was different. Her eyes were no longer filled with sadness and fear. They were sparkling with a secret. A billion-dollar secret. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the freedom. The freedom to walk out of this mansion and never look back. The freedom to help the women at the shelter, not with a few blankets, but with a new building with new lives. The freedom to find the woman she was before Donald Lewis turned her into a pretty, silent accessory. But with that freedom came a new problem, a new fear. In a world where everyone would soon see her as a walking lottery ticket, who could she possibly trust? She was more powerful than ever, but she was also more alone. She needed an ally. Someone smart. Someone tough. And someone who hated Donald Lewis as much as she now did. An old memory sparked in her mind. A name from long ago. A brilliant young lawyer who worked for Donald's company in the early days. A woman who had stood up to him, who had told him his business practices were wrong. A woman Donald had fired and ruined, making sure she would never work in the city again. Clara walked to her desk, her purpose clear. She opened her new laptop, the one Donald didn't know about, and began to search. A few minutes later, she found a number. She picked up her phone, took a deep breath, and dialed. A voice answered on the other end, and Clara's words were quiet but full of steel. "Hello," she said. "Is this Eleanor Vance?" Eleanor Vance's voice on the phone was exactly as Clara remembered. Sharp, intelligent, and with an edge of steel that had once made Donald nervous. Clara explained her situation, not as a heartbroken wife, but as a business partner who had been cheated. She told Eleanor everything, from the pawned necklace to the crumpled napkin. At first, Eleanor was hesitant, her old wounds from Donald's betrayal still raw. But then, Clara told her about the final piece of the puzzle, the one piece that changed the entire game. She told her about the lottery ticket. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then, for the first time, Eleanor Vance laughed. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday. It was to be held in the main boardroom at Apex Innovations, a room on the top floor of a glass skyscraper that touched the clouds. This was Donald's kingdom, a place designed to make others feel small and powerless. He sat at the head of a long, dark table, looking smug and impatient. His lawyer, Arthur, sat to his right, a mountain of papers in front of him. Donald didn't even look at Clara as she walked in. He just glanced at his gold watch, annoyed that she was 2 minutes late. But then he saw the woman who walked in beside her, and his smug expression faltered for just a second. "Eleanor," Donald said, his voice a mix of surprise and anger. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor Vance gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Donald. It's been a long time," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast room. She sat down opposite him, placing a single, thin folder on the table. "I'm representing Mrs. Lewis." Donald's surprise turned to rage. He pointed a finger at her. "Get out. You have no business here. You're a disgraced lawyer I fired years ago." Eleanor just kept smiling. "You did fire me, Donald, for telling the truth. And now, I'm here to make sure the truth is finally heard." Arthur, Donald's lawyer, cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This is highly irregular," he began, but Eleanor cut him off. "What's irregular is this pathetic divorce settlement," she said, tapping the papers he had brought. "You are offering my client a pittance, a tiny fraction of an empire she helped build from the ground up." Donald scoffed loudly. "She did nothing. She was a housewife who spent my money." Eleanor leaned forward. "Was it your money, Donald? Or was it her money? The money from her 2 jobs? The money from a certain pawned family heirloom that funded your very first prototype?" Donald's face went pale. He had no idea she knew about the necklace. He thought that was their secret, a part of the past he had successfully buried. He looked at Clara, but she wasn't the timid, sad woman he had thrown away. She was looking at him with a calm, steady gaze he had never seen before. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. "This is ridiculous," Donald stammered, trying to sound confident. "That was years ago. It has no bearing on this. This is just a desperate attempt to get more money." He sneered at Clara. "I knew you couldn't survive on your own. I knew you'd come crawling back for more." "You're right about one thing," Eleanor said smoothly. "This meeting is about money. But it's not about your money." On a silent cue from her lawyer, Clara reached into her simple handbag. She didn't say a word. Her movements were slow and deliberate. As Donald and Arthur watched in confusion, she pulled out the small, worn, wooden box. She placed it on the table between them. Donald's eyes narrowed. He recognized the box. A cruel smile touched his lips. "What is this, Clara?" he mocked. "Another piece of sentimental junk to remind me of our pathetic past?" Clara looked directly into his eyes. Her face was a perfect mask of calm. With a steady hand, she slowly opened the lid of the box. She reached inside and pulled out the lottery ticket. It looked small and foolish lying there on the polished billion-dollar boardroom table. A deep, ugly laugh erupted from Donald's chest. "A lottery ticket?" he roared, looking at his lawyer as if to share the joke. "This is your big plan? To show me a losing lottery ticket?" He looked back at Clara, his eyes filled with scorn. "I thought I told you not to spend all your future earnings in one place." He was still chuckling when Eleanor slid a single, crisp document across the table. It slid to a perfect stop right in front of him. "Perhaps you should look at this," she said, her voice quiet. Donald glanced down, his laughter catching in his throat. The document was an official confirmation from the State Lottery Commission. It showed a picture of the winning ticket, and the numbers matched the one on the table. It listed the prize amount in big, bold letters, $1 billion. And then, it listed the name of the sole, verified winner. The blood drained from Donald's face. His skin turned a sickly, gray color. He stared at the name printed in clean, black ink, Clara Lewis. His eyes darted from the paper to the ticket, then to Clara's face. She was still watching him, her expression unchanged. The smugness, the anger, the power, it all vanished from his face, replaced by a look of pure, horrified disbelief. The man who thought he had everything, who thought he had won, was staring at the woman he had thrown away. The woman who was now, in a single, impossible moment, a billionaire. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a slight, victorious smile finally gracing her lips. "As you can see, gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence, "my client has had a significant and recent change in her financial circumstances." Donald opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had been punched in the soul. In that silent, sky-high room, Donald Lewis, the titan of industry, the king of his own universe, finally understood what it felt like to have truly, absolutely lost it all. Donald didn't shout. He didn't scream. He just sat there, his face the color of wet cement, staring at a truth too big for his mind to hold. In that moment, he was no longer a king in his castle. He was just a man who had made the biggest mistake of his life. Clara stood up. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the boardroom, Eleanor right beside her. The sound of her simple shoes clicking on the marble floor was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of a queen leaving a kingdom she no longer wanted. The story was too good, too perfect, to stay a secret. It exploded into the news. Billionaire mocks wife's losing ticket? It's the billion-dollar jackpot. The world that had once admired Donald Lewis now pointed and laughed. The man who built his brand on being a winner was now the planet's biggest loser. His picture was everywhere, not on the cover of business magazines, but in silly cartoons, a foolish man throwing away a golden ticket. He had tried to humiliate Clara with a cheap piece of paper, and now that same piece of paper had humiliated him in front of the entire world. Clara never went back to the mansion. She didn't want the cold marble or the empty rooms. Her first act as a billionaire was to visit the women's shelter, the one place Donald had forbidden her from going. She walked in wearing simple clothes, and the women there greeted her as they always had, with warm smiles for just Clara. They had no idea who she now was. She looked at the crowded rooms and the leaking ceiling, and for the first time in a very long time, her heart felt full of a new, powerful purpose. This was where her new life would begin. She didn't just donate money. She bought the building. Then she bought the entire block. With the help of Eleanor Vance, she created the Clara Foundation, a safe place for women and children who had nowhere else to go. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a place of new beginnings. There were classrooms to learn new skills, a daycare so mothers could work, and beautiful, warm apartments where families could feel safe. She was building a home, not with cold money, but with the warmth and kindness she had been starved of for so long. One afternoon, while sorting through her few belongings from the old life, she found a picture of her and Donald from their wedding day. They were so young, so full of hope. A single tear rolled down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness for the man he became, but a tear for the boy he once was, the boy who had gotten lost somewhere on the road to riches. She put the picture away. That chapter of her life was over. She was no longer defined by his story, she was finally writing her own. As Clara was building lives, Donald's was falling apart. His new girlfriend, Sophia, left him. She had been attracted to the power and the image of the great Donald Lewis. She had no interest in being with a man who was now a national punchline. His business partners started to pull away, their trust shaken. He was left alone in his giant mansion, the same way he had left Clara, surrounded by expensive things that could offer no comfort. He had all the money he had fought so hard for, but he had never felt so poor. At the foundation's opening day, Clara stood beside a young woman named Maria. Maria had come to the shelter with her baby, running from a life of fear. Today, thanks to the foundation's help, she was starting her own small baking business. Maria hugged Clara tightly, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just give me a place to sleep," she whispered. "You gave me back my hope." In that hug, Clara felt a richness that no amount of money could ever buy. This was what it felt like to be truly wealthy. Years later, a reporter found Donald Lewis. He wasn't the powerful CEO anymore. He lived a quiet, solitary life. The reporter asked him if he had any regrets. Donald looked out the window for a long time, his face old and tired. "Everyone thinks I regret the money," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "But they're wrong. The money was never the prize. She was. I had the winning ticket in my hand for 20 years, and I was just too blind to see it." It was the first honest thing he had said in a very long time. Clara's story teaches us something so simple, yet so important. Your worth is never, ever decided by the person who is leaving you. It comes from within. It's a quiet strength that waits for you to finally see it. If this story touched your heart, if it gave you a little bit of hope, we would be so grateful if you would share that feeling. Please, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and like this video. And share it with just one person who might need a reminder that their greatest chapter might be the one they are about to write. In the end, Clara found a happiness she had never imagined. She wasn't Mrs. Donald Lewis, the billionaire's wife. She was Clara, the woman who built a safe harbor for others. Her name was whispered not in fancy boardrooms, but in the grateful prayers of the hundreds of women whose lives she had saved. The lottery ticket that Donald had mocked as a symbol of her foolish dreams had become a symbol of something far greater. It was proof that sometimes, in the most unbelievable ways, kindness wins, hope survives, and a new, beautiful beginning is always possible.